So we talk about these four transformations. I don't know if you want to talk about in the beginning or.
Yeah. So basically, just so you can understand the political history of Mexico, as you know, it's a history book, but it's politics. And basically, Mexico has gone through four major transformations in their political history. And these transformations mean regime change. So it means the way government works and operates differently, right? So as we see in the first transformation, it's the independence with Jose Maria Morelos in Hidalgo, who fought the independence from Spain. They both were priests, and they transformed in the first transformation of political history, and then Victoria became the first president of Mexico. But then, as you see, there's some problems in that era, and we make it into the second transformation of the political history of Mexico, which is led by Benito Juárez. This transformation meant the separation of church and state, so it was a major regime change, as you see. And then we move into what the book is, which is the Mexican Revolution, which is the third transformation, which is led, obviously, by Zapata and Villa in the rebel side, and Madero, who fought the revolution through the political arena, right? And then after that, we see now, basically 1 year ago, Mexico went into the fourth transformation. The fourth transformation led by the new president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador. And this is the first transformation done through peace and electoral democracy, right? All these three were done through wars. This one against Spain, this one against the conservatives of Mexico, and the French in the Batalla Puebla, Cinco de Mayo. We get drunk and all that. And then, right. And then Mexican Revolution, and then this one, right?
Isn't it a bit premature to call that one a transformation yet? Potentially.
Yes, I would say that we're just gonna go by what,
The rhetoric.
Yeah, exactly. That's where we're gonna go by, right? So, one question. Go ahead.
Sorry.
Come on, jump into it.
That didn't take long, did it?
Go ahead. Let's do it.
No, well, like, all right. So we're going for the fourth transformation with AMLO, and we're using the rhetoric that's used by the government to describe itself as, this being the fourth peaceful in this case, political transformation.
Right.
But what were the characteristics of the other ones that we would try or attempt to apply to this fourth transformation? Thank you.
Okay, so if you want me to go into it, I'll go right now. So put it this way.
Because I want to know.
In this case, we see that there are two priests trying to gain independence, right? And leading the Mexicans into this form of a republican state, right? Independent from Spain and sovereign, right? So that's a regime change, right? That's because that's the center of everything. Regime change is the way the government operates and how it works, right? New policy is different from what they used to be. So this one's already trying to become sovereign, right? In this part of the era, I don't know if you guys remember, probably you guys know, but Mexico owned part of the United States, right?
Right.
So a man by the name of Antonio López de Santa Anna was a man that initially fought in the Alamo, killed, San Houston and all these people. But then he ended up basically selling Mexico, that part of Mexico to the United States. And the French, who in that moment Mexico entered into this economic unstable and political unstable period. The French, the Spaniards, and the British came into Mexico and said, hey, look, what's going to happen? Are you guys going to pay us, right? So in this case, Benito Juárez, the conservatives were in power in that moment. The conservatives were aligned with the French, and they were allowing, these foreign, I would say, invaders to come and take all the Mexican, I would say, resources and all this, right?
Isn't that also where Porfirio became famous?
Give me a second. I'm going right there. Get right there. Going right
before the third.
So in this moment, Presidente Benito Juárez was president of the Supreme Court. So Mexico, he steps in as president, and he fights this war from the liberal side against the conservatives who wanted this French ties, right, with the conservative. And his point of view was, Mexico is being driven by the church, and the conservatives are with them, and the French are with them. So Benito Juárez decides to fight them. It's a bloody war, but then he ends up winning The only problem was it's a back and forth. The French come back and this and that. And Porfirio Diaz, who was actually a Juarista in the beginning, he becomes the president. But Porfirio Diaz does not follow that model of government that Juarez wanted. He actually stays in power and becomes elitist and sides with the conservatives and the elites of Mexico. So from there, we start seeing these inequalities, and what Zapata and Villa were asking more towards the the beginning of the 20th century. They're like, so what? Benito Juarez did all this in vain. What's the point of this regime change, right? So the landowners basically had strong ties to Porfirio Diaz, and Porfirio Diaz kept that system of haciendas and peasants, right? I don't know if that's basically in the beginning of the book when he's talking about, he appoints Escandón, and Escandón is like this puppet,
It's a
right?
comparison to fiefdoms, only it's also,
Yeah.
they say that deliberately we're not going to
Yeah.
call it that because it's not Europe.
Exactly.
It's
So
in
it's like a
Iran.
viceroy. He puts him as a little viceroy,
But he compares it to
Yeah. But he tries to keep the system the way it is, and he forgets about the peasants. And remember, these peasants, as you said, you're going to talk about later.
Yeah, but later. But these peasants were A, indigenous, or B, rather they felt like they had an ancestral claim to the land.
Mm-hmm.
So it's it's really it was hard for them because a lot of them lived in like serfdom. Either leave or stay and work on the haciendas. For
peons.
yeah,
Yeah,
essentially.
As an hourly employee
Yeah.
or day labor.
Right. Yeah.
Daily labor.
But they didn't own the land.
Yeah.
And so that we'll get into that later.
Yeah.
But that is a big reason.
And that is what pushes into this new regime change, because the only way you could change this type of system is taking over the administration of the state. And what's the administration of the state? Government, right? So essentially, in that moment, Porfirio Diaz, which we're going to talk about a little bit, I don't want to get the book before we go into the critiques and all that, but Porfirio Diaz does not want to, lose the grip of power. He wants to keep it. And then we're going to see these political actors, these three, come into play to fight Porfirio Diaz. Eventually, the transformation happens, and then we go into that third transformation. Then they institutionalize it, and then something happens in the 80s in Mexico, which is a neoliberal period, which is totally different from a revolutionary institutional way of leading government, right? It's a crashing period.
I was waiting for that.
So what happens in the pre-party? The pre-party splits. And who was one of them that leaves? That guy. So then we're talking about the same rhetoric. This guy has been talking about, basically he's claiming himself as the modern opposition leaders of the current establishment, the way Juarez claimed he was before when the conservatives were, the way Morelos was when the Spaniards were in power. So that's where the rhetoric is going into that fourth transformation. The only difference that this time it's not with war, is to elect with those.
Peaceful transfer of power.
Come full circle.
And AMLO does evoke the memory of Zapata
Yeah, and that's
quite often.
and we're gonna see why, and I'm gonna explain you why,
Hero
and
worship.
yeah, and I'm gonna give you the recommended readings
Yeah,
where.
we see a few recommendations.
Because remember, he's a political scientist. He's making this. AMLO's been claiming this for years.
He's dreaming
It's
about
interesting-
making the fourth
It's
transformation.
interesting that Chavez invokes the memory of Bolivar and the sword of Bolivar,
Right, yeah.
Castro.
and Castro invokes the memory of Jose Marti.
Yes. Oh, yeah, exactly. So it's just claiming yourself.
Endurance going to invoke Morazan.
Exactly. Yeah, that's what I've been saying.
Building our
So, yeah,
shoulders
so
of giants.
Now I gave you a little insight of what this is. Remember, this is the third transformation. This was the third most important moment in the timeline of the history of Mexico. And it was led by Zapata from the rebel side and Madero from the political side. But Zapata as a rebel leader and a man with, I would say, values, not too much political, but very towards his I would say,
Really loyal
the
to his
peasants
allies.
and people that were loyal to him.
Those
So-
are people from Morelos,
And-
states from.
Yeah, and that's what basically the book, right?
Yeah, really, pushing for main motivation, land reform,
Yeah.
agrarian reform.
Yeah, it was
So-
nothing like Marxism, or it it was more the people, but
Grassroots.
exactly.
Grassroots,
Yeah.
and Zapata and Villa did not want to be politicians.
Yeah.
They didn't want to arrive
Yeah.
in Mexico City and run the country, right? We'll get into that later, but
that's
these
the
people, they did not want to run the country, be politicians. So, okay.
hit it.
Let me just ask, so
Yeah,
is
sure.
that your graphics? It's really nice.
Oh yeah, we made him.
Oh, yeah.
Very effective.
Yeah. Thank you. Yep. Hit it.
Next slide.
Oh,
That's it.
Oh,
there we go.
Bam.
Oh, I
okay,
like that
so,
picture.
So,
Very
before
fun.
talking about diving more into the guts
Yeah, I
of the
googled
book,
him. I never
talk
saw
about
this
the author,
picture.
John Womach. Really impressive guy.
Yes.
Obviously, we know he's a historian. And one thing I just want to comment is the amount of research that went into this book, and the variety of sources you see in the
Mhm.
notes, the bibliography was truly outstanding. I understand, even for me and maybe for Robert, I mean, it was difficult at times, referring to a lot of dates, names, characters, kind of jumping back and forth chronologically. As a whole, the book does move forward chronologically, but it does refer back to many dates, in the past and many other actors. So it can be confusing, but it doesn't, I don't think we can discount, how impressive the research you did for this book was. You go,
Mhm.
some of the sources are from, like 1910, an interview with this guy in this village, So it's really impressive.
Well, in the video, he says that he was the first one to arrive in the morning at the research library and the last one to leave. And he
Mhm.
skipped lunch, so he just worked all.
Right. So it shows dedication.
The exact moments.
He's an
that
expert
happened.
in Mexican history. He's a PhD from Harvard. Yeah, so he focuses on Mexican, Cuban, and Colombian history, with an emphasis on agrarian and labor history. So obviously that shines in this book.
Where is he from?
He's from
Oklahoma.
He's from
He's not from Ohio.
Ohio.
He's not from Ohio.
No,
He's not from
What
Ohio.
happened? Ohio dropped the
South
ball.
He's from There is an O.
Say,
dropped the ball.
no matter where I just want to say, no matter where these people are from, let's not discount the value of expertise.
Yes.
Yeah.
No,
People
yeah.
are
And,
experts.
and
And dedicated
Mexican,
their
yeah,
lives.
Mexican.
Are you actually from
Absolutely.
Ohio? Oklahoma.
He's secretly from Ohio.
He's
Right.
like
And
first
And I just
one.
want to say his interview that you guys posted was in Spanish,
Yeah.
so that's amazing.
Yeah,
I just
exactly.
wanted to say.
Yeah,
Right.
his Spanish is pretty good. You saw in the interview.
And,
Yeah.
and
It
I want
sounded
to say
good to
that
me.
too, which is like
that.
tanto Womach like the rest of them. I think obviously they got where they got their PhDs and their studies for a reason, and I can
Right, yeah.
appreciate that.
Yeah.
My whole thing is that it would be nice if there was like more, because I'm
Yeah,
sure there's people with equal,
Yeah.
But what I really liked about Womach, at least what I kind of read in the video and everything too, is that at least for me personally, he definitely has a little bit more
Yeah.
legitimacy than the other guys we've read,
Put
just
the work in.
because.
He knows Spanish.
Well, first of all, yeah, in the video, his Spanish is really good. Como que it's very good
His
looking.
Spanish is almost
There's,
perfect.
Yeah,
honestly.
there's that, but then there's also like you can tell that it's not just like he just doesn't want to know the facts. Like he has like a care for
Yeah.
these
He's
people,
more
Well,
and
Yeah,
We'll get
going on
into
that,
that,
he
right?
received an award
And
in
that's
Mexico
what I was
City
going
in
to.
2009.
that
Yeah.
for
Award.
me speaks a lot. That
Yeah.
the fact that he
So
gave that away.
Mexican people see, he truly cares, and they appreciate, his research.
Are you going to talk about his green corn
Into the
rebellion
topic.
pieces?
No, I haven't planned.
Do you want to talk about it?
I just always ask, so what's the
Sure,
motivation
go ahead,
of
yeah,
a
tell
historian,
us.
a writer, or whoever, an expert of that level? So what motivates them? Because I could tell a little bit of where their positive or negative biases and where they're going with it. So you probably know more than I do about the thesis that never got published, the Green Corn Rebellion, which was local for him, close
This
to
was in
home.
Oklahoma.
Yes.
Yeah, I
You
think you
probably-
mentioned it in the video.
Do you want to say what it was?
No.
Okay, so it was farmers who banded together because they were in the United States, in the south central area where he was from, and they were protesting the land grabbing that was going on by the political and the different kind of power holders, politicians and people with money. And it was also a grassroots movement. They marched, they came together, they got a little bit pushy physically. It wasn't like a whole, strap the bullets on your chest and, shoot them down, but they actually did make enough splash with their protests to have recognition. In the end, they did not achieve everything they had wanted to resist the land grabbing, but it just was so striking that he spent time researching that, and then he transferred to a very similar agrarian rebellion in Mexico, and he went all in with this one. So it must have been like a passion, that something that irked him, that it never got resolved in the U.S.
Yeah, and I
definitely
think
draw
he
a
does
line.
mention it in the video too.
Yeah,
like he
everybody
says,
That's what
like,
made me look it up.
Yeah,
He
that he was
mentioned
from
it.
our farmer background, and that for him it was something
Yeah.
very real to him, like very.
So he was used to this power issue, and so that maybe
Mhm.
drove him to the lengths of research and the height of
Yeah.
expertise.
Well, yeah, I mean, he understands the relation between the oppressor and the oppressed,
Mhm.
and which a lot of time plays out in land, many places in Latin America.
Exactly.
All right, so this is a picture of him at Harvard. I think at a rally.
He is a professor at Harvard, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think he's retired now. They were rallying for the student unions.
He was the chairperson at one point. Yeah, he retired in 2009.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's
You
just.
did mention that in your post.
Yeah, and I don't think that he was just fascinated with the power and all that stuff. I think he was also in my other class we had to read a book called Silencing the Past. So I think he realizes that a lot of these people's stories are silenced throughout history.
The humble folk.
Yes, and he was saying, I read something else about him. It was saying how when he was learning history, it's like the professors weren't taking it seriously. The next thing you know, he becomes director of, the history department. And as you can see, all these sources, he took it very seriously. So, yeah.
And the last thing I forgot to mention real quick is that I got the understanding and reading about the Green Corn Rebellion that in that time he came to align somewhat with socialist ideals. And I'm not sure that I understand enough from this book how much that influenced him in his biases, but it seemed to come through to me at least that a similar alignment with socialism as the answer to the colonial and the Western style.
He wrote amongst his papers, yeah.
Yeah.
He's a self-professed Marxist historian, which is
Well,
impressive.
that explains a lot.
Well, that came out with the
That
Green.
explains a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, they were interested
Yeah.
in those theories.
I think he posted that he's a Marxist. He actually put
Yeah, yeah.
an
But
article.
he did fully come out with it. That's what I wasn't
Yeah,
sure.
And I think it's interesting because the time that he was getting his PhD versus the time that he was like retiring and he was public with it. Like that's why I think when this was published, he wasn't that out about it. He was more like subtle about it. He wouldn't say like I'm a Marxist because this was written before the fall of the Soviet Union.
Written in '68. I think.
Yeah,
It's
so
a
he,
dangerous time.
Cold War.
Yeah.
right,
Cold
Yeah.
War.
Dangerous
Yeah.
time to
so he would never say that.
He
But
was a closet Marxist.
he was a closet. Then he comes out and it's accepted
I think they're
because
called leanings.
yeah, comes out of the
That's
Marxist
what-
closet. Marxist closet.
That's a nice way of saying it. Yeah.
So that was like the final, I forgot to say, that was my final takeaway of what bridged him into this
Yeah.
history and research, because now it starts to come to
Yeah.
You can definitely draw a line
Definitely.
between those two. So moving on to the structure and the style of the book. It offers a background leading up to the revolution. It doesn't just dive in, to what happened with the revolution, but instead offers background context, which obviously is important. The relationship between the states and the central government, specifically Morelos, and how Porfirio Diaz plays essentially a lackey to the governorship, I think it was,
Yep.
of Morelos Escandon. I already mentioned the variety of sources, manuscripts, public record, the amount of work this guy had to do to write this is just incredible. Sources ranging from English, Spanish, and French. So he has I don't know if he reads French or he has somebody translate from it, but he does draw from different languages, which obviously opens an entire new world up to you if you're capable of doing that. And I thought it was interesting. It kind of reads like historical fiction.
Definitely.
Historical fiction with notes and bibliography. Some parts I think maybe, embellished or dramatized, but I see it as a positive. That's what I thought I read. So it's not dry in the sense that it's pure history. Some parts are maybe dramatized a little bit. So you see it as a negative or positive.
Why the word fiction? Because I also had that same argument in my brain. So what did you?
It's a good question. I just think because it reads more like maybe fiction. Putting that word in there, it might be debatable.
Yeah.
But I don't know,
Narrative?
the term historical narrative might be a little better.
I found the
better.
way that he describes people's motives brought in so much interpretation that I was also questioning. So where exactly does this fit it? Like
Yeah.
fiction, narrative,
That's
or
true.
essay?
I think narrative might be better just considering that it is true.
But I also think oh sorry.
No, go ahead.
No,
I think well,
Oh, you guys, I don't know what you. You hang on.
Go
ahead,
ahead,
go
go
ahead.
ahead, go
sorry
ahead.
guys. I didn't see you were raising your hand over there. I think one of the things that kind of takes you to say historical fiction is at least it's from the literature I read before, like what I mentioned last class or agenda and stuff, that these are historical fictions based on real stories. It feels very much like that. And I'm wondering for you, since you're like, did literature and everything, it's kind of like your thing, how you, like, there was parts for me that it almost felt like he was making the characters talk amongst each other.
Right.
Like,
That's
even if it
what-
didn't
that's
feel
what
like,
I
a reference, yeah,
right.
about that. So I think it could go both ways: historical narrative or historical fiction. Maybe the term historical fiction came to mind because it was dramatic. There are many characters discussing many dramatic things, like and when the revolution started, I felt like there was a lot of passion that was being transmitted
Sentiment
through
through
the
the-
motivation.
I was gonna say it reads like an. So when you're doing anthropology, ethnography, just cultural writing, trying to develop a perspective from the inside of a
Yes.
particular people, which we'll see in like 2 or 3 weeks. But what's interesting is that he takes different perspectives. And so to me, it was like a weird historic ethnography. But it's an ethnography with people who are like that lived in this other period, some of which were like not alive. And so you're using like parts of written culture to do it. And so I read it more like an anthropology book, and that actually made it refreshing. And something that when I was like reading like in undergrad, particularly towards the end in anthropology, people, since they embed themselves in the culture, they start telling stories like people in the culture will tell the stories.
Yes.
As they go. And I think he did that super well.
Yes.
Which, from a history background, I'm like, which I don't have. I would imagine I think it's whack. But from an anthropologist background, I was like, oh, that's actually pretty. Like, it's pretty impressive.
Yeah.
So
No,
I thought it was cool.
Yeah, good.
Was it easier to read if you
was cool.
look at it through that lens?
Yeah, and I think
Easier to
that
read,
it is very Western of us. Something that I'll say because we were being so nice to each other.
Right.
It is very Western of us to say that because something is told in a narrative format and not a didactic, systematic format, that it's less true or less factual. That's very
Good
Western.
point. Good
That's
point.
very Western. And so if you're going to tell stories like
Storytelling.
Mexican farmers, then from the 19-teens, then you probably would tell it more in a narrative format than you would in the didactic format.
Yeah.
There's an American author named Alan W. Eckert that I used to
sounds
read
familiar.
25 years ago.
Okay.
He is a historian, but he has written a series of books on U.S. history, frontier history, in exactly what you're talking about, in a dramatized historical narrative.
Yeah.
For example, one that I enjoyed was The Frontiersman, which is the history of Kentucky seen through the character of Simon Kenton, who is an actual historical figure. But he tells it like a story, and it makes it quite interesting.
Yeah.
However, it's not fictionalized because it's based on solid research
Yeah.
and facts and details.
Right. So fiction,
Historical narrative.
for us as Westerners, like you say, has a whole separate connotation. But that's clarifying. So it is true. Storytelling could be considered fiction, but not by our definition.
Go ahead, Brad.
Oh, since the very beginning I started to reading the book, I have the feeling that I was reading a novel.
Yeah.
And I don't like novels. That's why it was hard for me to continue reading.
Well,
Real, bro.
yeah,
I said I don't like
it
novels.
does sound like a novel.
Yeah.
It does. It's not. It's
'Cause
not
it's
like it's not like
yeah.
a textbook.
Yeah, because you're like,
Not
oh,
at all.
the person met and they looked at each other, and it was
Yeah.
like, so it was like,
Yeah.
this is like, I know
7 or 8
this.
years of graduate school pretty much killed my ability to read a novel. Not that I didn't like them, I just couldn't read them.
I think that's what makes the book so cool. Like as a
Yeah, I
It
personally
does.
as a
like that.
dissertation, as a historian in Harvard, to
Yeah.
be like, yeah, I'm just gonna tell a good story. Like
Yeah.
screw you. Like I'm totally gonna read into how these people would
Yeah,
interact.
'cause-
I think that's
Yeah,
kind of
that's
awesome.
actually true. That's actually true. Yeah, because
And-
for people that don't want to read straight politics, like
Yes.
plan this, plan
It's a
that.
totally different kind of reading. Like
Yeah.
we'll see when we get to Alfred Stepan or Sonia Alvarez, that's a totally different kind of reading. You have to carry in your head causal variables and theory and her research design. It's totally different.
And I think it's kind of what Eric was mentioning too about it, us having like a very set idea of what should and should not be, like, how it should or should not be told, in the sense that these are people, kind of what we saw with Diego Rivera and other people, right? These were mostly illiterate people that didn't have a lot of education. It was one of their things. So if you're
Good
going to tell
point.
their
Good
story,
point.
you would want to do it in a way, and I think that's part of, again, his legitimacy and why Mexico, or Mexicans, like academics as well as like scholars, kind of really took on this book and really like approved it, I guess, in a way.
That's the interesting thing about it, because he doesn't face backlash for trying to tell their stories.
Right.
I did
I think he did, but not as highly as
some of
like,
the other authors.
yeah,
I think
some of the other authors.
It's weird because I feel like a lot of this might be getting to what I'm talking about. I feel like a lot of the people who would criticize him would be like postmodern historians, like, why are you, white person, telling these,
Yeah.
people's stories? But most of those people would also probably be Marxists. So, so if you like ain't with them, you can't criticize one of your own.
It's
I
a
don't
catch
know.
22.
It's a catch-22. It's like, which is like the ultimate high IQ play. But I don't know. I don't want to read too far into
Like
it.
40 charts.
It is 40 chess. My man.
Well, let me just add, this is a good place to add what I was going to say earlier, is
Go
that
ahead.
there's a whole genre of there's a whole genre of peasant studies.
Yeah.
Peasant resistance, peasant rebellions, and also what's called resistance studies. And maybe we'll talk a little bit more about it at the end.
Definitely.
But this would fall into that category as one of the early works on peasant resistance.
Definitely.
And they did it well.
Mhm.
They did it well.
That was exactly my my uncle did his PhD on the origins of apartheid in South Africa, and that's exactly what he did. He went from farmhouse to farmhouse through the whole Sveld, all of South Africa, and collected letters, documents, put them together, and gave their perspective as a counterpoint to the traditional view of
It's important to tell those stories.
A famous one is James C. Scott, who did The Weapons of the Weak, and it's done from an anthropological disciplinary framework. But he does interviews and participant observation and lives with families, and this basically comes to the conclusion that they use all kinds of subterfuge, sabotage, getting sick and not going to work, dragging their feet as subtle ways of resisting
civil.
their oppressors.
Was your uncle doing that
From Princeton Theological Seminary.
and what was that like a cultural studies thing, or was that like
It was part of his theological PhD, and
Okay.
he just wanted to say that the Dutch settlers were not responsible for apartheid, as the British had always claimed. So he did original research, and those farmers took out their boxes, and took out their letters, photos, and told stories from the parents and grandparents, and then basically a similar way.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Moving on to criticism and praises. I think we may have already covered most of this. About the chronological part, as I said, as a whole, the book moves forward chronologically, but he jumps a little bit back and forth, referencing these dates and these persons. So if you guys have any criticisms or negative aspects of the book, speak now or forever hold your peace. Now we're going to move on to the meat, meat and potatoes.
I did see a lot of posts where they said that too many names and all that, and I understand that.
Yeah, and Robert made a good point actually.
Yeah.
Lack of visuals
Yeah.
Yeah.
would maybe the other book that Alejandro had.
The most newest one.
There's
Yes.
like newer versions
Yes.
that have
Okay,
a little
yeah.
bit more.
And painted visuals
Yes.
with his words. You
Yes.
have to say.
True.
Yes.
Yeah.
He tried.
He did work that out.
Yeah, but even then, like a map would have been nice, like a more
Yeah.
like.
Yeah.
There's
That's what
only-
the audience
there's one,
was
like,
for.
There was only one map.
There was one map
It's
at the
just on one of
beginning,
those.
but
But
I
it-
was
But it
like,
helped me
But
because
there's a lot
I
of
mean, it helped,
scenes.
but I
There's a
was,
lot
I
of
was
scenes
lost. I
that we
didn't,
would have.
I didn't locate myself.
There was a lot of
Anywhere.
scenes that we would have loved to see. At least a little picture. It's
Right.
Right.
like, let's see the context of them. Yeah, exactly. That's like basically.
that might have to do with the time that the book was published.
Yes.
So like if it was
for the
published,
audience
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
The audience was this
Yeah.
group of
Yeah.
knowledgeable
Yeah.
professors at
Yeah.
Harvard who would
But
already.
who doesn't
Yeah.
like to
They
see
wouldn't need
pictures? Come
And
on.
if you're already
That's the
familiar
thing,
with
you don't wanna
Mexican
watch
history,
movies.
it would make
Everyone wants to see
it would be a
pictures.
lot easier to read.
Yes.
Yeah.
If you're learning about Mexican history for the first time,
Yeah, it gets
there's,
overwhelming.
there's a way too much detail.
Like
Yeah.
most of us, like
My
I
dream.
think that's the case for
Yeah.
most of us,
Except
right?
Robert.
Definitely.
Oh, that's
Everyone
why everyone was
except
jumping
Robert.
on Robert.
No way.
Now I get it.
That I don't want to impose on anyone, but I think like you're the only one that
The brain didn't
That-
explode.
yeah,
Well, that's the thing.
because you know Mexican history
Yeah.
and you love it.
Yeah. I do.
That's an understatement.
I
And,
have
it, and,
another
it, and it was
side story.
easier for me to break it down when we were doing the slideshow, and I'm like,
Yeah.
let's do it this way,
His
and
idea
that's
was
the way they're
before
gonna understand it more.
That explains the group chat a lot more now. I get
Exactly.
it.
Because if we start putting all those names and what they did, I think
You know, yeah.
I mean we end the revolution tomorrow. Like
Well,
Yeah.
let's not hold you back.
No, definitely.
Yeah.
Honestly,
So-
the
yeah.
book was just dry. To me, at least, it was very
Could be a
dry,
product
very
of time as
cumbersome.
Not
very-
enough economics, not enough Honduras.
Not enough Honduras. Too much Mexico. Not enough Honduras. It was
Yeah.
just just annoying to read. I feel so bummed out because like
You don't like to read about the hinterlands? The
Ah,
But you
Honduran-
know,
It has neoliberal tendencies.
Don't do that to her.
It
no, don't do that
infringes.
to
It
me.
infringes on
No,
his-
it just like the history itself. It's nice to know about you know Mexican history and the revolution, but like the book was just like cumbersome to
I-
get through.
I really
just-
think that a lot of it has to do with your personal likes on
Yeah.
what type of things you like to
Yeah.
read, not just you, like anyone. Because
Yeah.
I think it's funny you mention it because most of the stuff that you really like to read is the stuff that I've been like, oh my god, it's so
Yeah.
annoying. And now that this that I kind of
Yeah.
liked it more, you're like,
Are
oh,
you
I hate
enjoying
this.
Carletto Coletto?
I've not started reading yet, but
Okay,
I,
let us know if you enjoy that.
And you know
That's
what?
a hard read for me.
What
Oh,
happened?
Who are you?
If what's
Imagine
happened?
for us.
What happened in this book too that I criticize a lot, and then I understand why it's
Rare
overwhelming.
form was the
It's
only
because
thing I liked.
there's only like a little period of time where a lot of things change.
Yeah.
New leaders, you know, the rebels, and blah, blah, blah. So I understand where most of you are coming from in that short, like in
In
short
the
amount of
first
time.
two
Yeah,
chapters,
yeah.
how many people like leave
And
come
governor
back
here,
and
yeah, governor here, general there. Yeah, governor here, general there,
But I think
president here.
that helped me
Yeah.
who knew zero about Mexican
Yeah.
history. Oh my god, that
Yeah.
helped me to understand the complexity of it and to respect the fact that unless I get a little feeling of that, I won't understand
Yeah.
the passion of the resistance.
Yes.
Because that amount of change would make anybody's head spin.
Yes.
So it's got to unsettle even the most stable part of society. And I think it was good that he kept that in there. For us, it's
Mhm.
annoying. But in the end, I felt, wow, okay, now I have the perspective of those stable folk
Yeah.
who just got totally, their world got shaken up. That changed.
Exactly.
We're reading it and we're annoyed. Imagine people who live.
Yeah, good point.
Exactly.
You have a good
Right.
way with words.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
Yeah, they had like what 3 presidents in 4 years.
I think
Yeah.
more, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
started with Diaz, right? And like, whatever.
Yeah.
We'll
We'll do that.
move
Yeah.
on to
Definitely.
that, yeah. So,
So okay, everyone, you explain the plan.
sure, yeah. I mean, the Plan de Ayala, which is actually the Appendix B in the book, I think he has the entirety of it printed out. Any comments on it? Anyway, this was what Womach called the sacred scripture of the Zapatistas, right? And so it's on page 199. Essentially, it's a 15-point plan that laid out the goals of the revolutionaries, specifically Zapata, right? Which centered around land reform. It was a response to Francisco Madero, who we'll speak about later, who was president for a short period of time, right? Yeah, so he was allied with the revolutionaries, but Zapata and the revolutionaries really wanted him to go in and, go scorched earth, redistribute the land and carry out the goals of the revolutionary right away. And we found a quote on page 189. Only a regime constituted according to his Ayala plan could guarantee the eventual enactment and enforcement of agrarian reform. So they were really, really insistent that the Plan de Ayala really had to be carried out, no ifs, ands, or buts.
It's
That
the
was
only way.
way to carry out the revolution correctly, right?
Yeah, the only basically in this we're gonna be talking about Plan Ayala as we go on, but this is the main goal of Zapata basically, and we have to understand that his way of thinking of this new regime, of this new way of governing, and is only through his eyes is Plan Ayala. Plan Ayala was the only way. If it didn't go his way, then there was no transformation. There was no change.
So that kind of
Sacred
answers
scripture.
Celine's
Mhm.
comment that I remember that you said some leaders become flexible
Mm-hmm.
when they get into the position of power.
And
So
yeah,
he laid out the fact, I'm not going to be flexible. So I imagine that's why some
Mhm.
sources thought he needed to take it down.
exactly, and that's what we're going to be talking because that's very key. This book does side a lot with Zapata on many issues, and what I'm going to try to show you is yes, he was a good man in all this, but he also he didn't understand the political arena as
He loves to be contradictory.
Yes.
Right, as we said, these
Yeah.
people we're not statesmen, we're
Yes.
not politicians.
Yeah,
It's
you
important
have-
to take into account where they came from.
like he was a great man, and his ideas and his people and the peasants had a good vision of what economics should be, but
But you still need some political
yeah, and the
Right.
thing,
understanding.
and when you clash.
How to diplomacy.
When you clash, sometimes you call people counter-revolutionary or against the revolution, and probably it's not the way. You just want to do it in a more moderate and more
Right.
inclusive
We
way
use
of doing
through,
it.
through legal channels,
Exactly.
democratically. And so these changes won't
Yes.
happen overnight.
Yeah,
Maybe they'll take years
Yes.
to see the effects. But unfortunately,
Yeah.
the Zapatistas
Yeah.
look at them
It's
overnight.
the eternal struggle of being either an incrementalist or,
Yeah.
or a radical.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's,
And I think the letdown, right? Like
Yeah.
being let down
And-
so much for the government and people where you're
exactly.
kind
And there's
of
something I want to point out that I read in another book.
So it's the difference between Joe Biden or Pete Buttigieg.
Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, I think that would be
Oh,
more
I said
appropriate.
Biden. I meant Sanders.
Sanders. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
was gonna say.
Bernie Sanders or Pete Buttigieg.
Yeah, there
I,
is
I
a
would say
Such-
yeah.
So yeah, I want to mention what Zapata said when they asked him once about the presidency and the chair of the presidency. He said that chair, I'm gonna say it in Spanish, esa silla lo atonta. So from there, you could see that Zapata was a man that
would be it.
Zapata was like
More dangerous.
politicians.
We're not politicians.
We're not politicians,
Yeah.
and I don't want to be mixed with politicians. So you could, from that point of view, you could see the clash he had with the political.
So he was a revolutionary more than a politician.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
But at some
Exactly.
point, those two things, if
Yeah.
you're carrying out revolution, the politics will enter. It's inevitable.
Do you
Inevitable.
think that
Cannot
like
avoid, yeah.
for somebody like Zapata or even more modern times, part of that rejection toward politics could be again the letdown that they felt has happened through
Right.
politics for
yeah.
so long, and kind of that they have to
That
take
was-
action into their own hands.
Well,
and
Yes.
kind of-
everything.
Yeah.
That was
Yeah,
the
no, they were
yeah.
gung-ho.
Which again, it's kind of what we've touched in other classes, where like, yeah, this building up of nations
Yeah.
has happened here in the U.S.,
Yes.
but here in the U.S. you don't see as much as that
Yeah.
as Latin American countries, where you kind of like you feel it. It's
And-
like you just don't count on the
And what I
government.
want to make people, I want to make people understand what happened to Madero, and I'm going to talk about later on, is that when you become head of state, you're not only ruling for one side. You have to remember that there's other people that are Mexicans, even though they're conservative or elitist, but they're Mexicans.
Mhm.
And it's not about oh no, I'm gonna carry out my policies. Yeah, you're gonna try to carry out your
Crown
policy,
is heavy on the
but you also have to you have to realize that hey, they're Mexicans, they live with us, and they're part of our society. They're our friends. We eat with them. We see them in the streets. It's not like hey, peasants here, we're all for them, and then everyone else screw
Right.
them, because that's not a leader.
Well, that's
It's
the
easy
that's
way.
the
Yeah.
ideal, right? The ideal, regardless. But then it
I
seems
know.
to be a pendulum where either they go too much to
Yeah.
one
And
side or
whoever
too much
does
to
it-
the other.
No matter what party it is or what, that's not the role. That
I mean, all you have to do is look at Porfirio Diaz, who was a
Yeah.
liberal with
Yes.
Juarez,
Juarez.
but it was under the Liberal Party that most indigenous peoples lost most of their collective ejidos
Exactly.
because of their ideology of the free market and individual rights. Inadvertently worked to undermine indigenous rights to their collective lands.
It
Mhm.
worked in their context, not in the national context.
It's also your
They couldn't transfer the idea
Yeah.
to the
Or
other
different
context.
perspective.
Yeah, yeah.
You're leading like so not just the classes, but you're also leading all of.
Well, that's the thing. You have to realize that you have to compromise. You can't.
Yeah.
And if you're doing it one-sided, then you're going to see
Well,
polarization.
there's that flexibility.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Which
And
is
so
what tends to
that
happen.
was not satisfactory to the revolutionaries.
And let me tell you something. Zapata thought that way too, but the other ones thought about Madero the same way. It was like if he was,
Madero was put in a tough position.
he was, yeah.
He really couldn't win.
History absolved him, like,
Oh right, yeah.
but
It's an
Yeah.
interesting hypothetical to
Yeah.
think about what would have happened if he had a
Yeah.
fair chance.
a fair chance.
Yeah.
Because to be honest,
Zapata
Zapata
really-
was the leader of the rebels, but Madero was the main
Right.
challenger to Diaz, and that's what I'm gonna mention.
Yeah.
So this is where we're gonna start. The books.
Obrigado.
So the book starts where Porfirio Diaz.
Is that
Diaz.
Porfirio?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh
yeah.
wow.
Porfirio Diaz, as you know, he came from this liberal side, Benito Juarez. In the that separation of the state and church, and he was in the army during Benito Juarez's presidency, and he shared those values until he made it to the presidency, right?
Right.
But he did have that mentality of governing for one side, and that's where all this friction came, and you could see the inequality that Mexico suffered during his presidency. And it's interesting that I want to mention too, Porfirio Diaz, in fact, he lived in El Castillo de Chapultepec, which is like a castle in Mexico City. He didn't want El Palacio Nacional, which El Palacio Nacional represents for the liberals more of this is the people's house. The other one's was more like,
Vice royal.
yeah, exactly, different, away from the people.
Elite.
Exactly. In El Castillo de Chapultepec, it's very separated from society. It's more where Los Pinos was, which is the other president. I'll explain how. So what happened? Porfirio Diaz opened up his liberal way of seeing was, investment, more we would say of a capitalist modern day era.
Foreign investment.
Exactly, foreign investment. He allowed the French to come back, the British to come back, the Spaniards, the Americans to come back. Exactly. So what happened was, at this moment, his policies were not focused towards what the Juaristas or the former Juaristas were expecting. And what happens when this model starts to kick in? We start seeing these inequalities, and we start seeing this elitist. In Mexico City, Guadalajara, the big cities, we start seeing this different culture as a lot of money of being elitist, and we also see the slums, right? Because that's where most poverty is eradicated, right? In the slums, in the areas, in the big cities, urbanized. But what happens in the rural areas, right? That's where we start seeing the real uprisings. And you explain a little bit more about that.
Right, yeah, the uprising and a turning point. Really, I mean, he was in office for
A lot.
yeah,
long
Way
time.
too many.
For a long time.
Too long.
A really important event was an interview he gave to an American journalist. I don't remember his first name. His last name was Krillman. Right, it's on page 10. It starts on page 10. You guys can read more about it. Essentially, in the interview, he says he's going to allow an opposition to form under his blessing. He's saying, I will allow opposition to form, and essentially absolving the throne, right? And so this was a big announcement, and what it led to was kind of like a rush for people to either form political parties or decide to run for the presidency, right? So that was a big moment that really kicked Mexico into this a lot of uncertainty, and B, many people kind of scrambling to challenge him.
Yeah.
That's where Madero comes in.
Right. And the moment in that area was already that the peasants were already starting to, revolt. It was like, why the land, why the haciendas, these big owners, and we don't have a chance to own something. Why don't we have a chance to cultivate? Why do they have to take all the earnings? Why do we have to work for them almost for free, right? And then we start seeing in Morelos when he appoints Escandon as his little puppet, basically, as this viceroy, basically, he's basically letting them know, no, I'm not going to take care of you. I'm going to put someone in charge, but we're still not going to solve anything, right?
And you guys cannot choose your leader.
Exactly.
I'm appointing somebody who I know will serve my interests.
So on a social level, we're talking about discontent between the hacienda leaders, the peasants. On an economic level, we're seeing the peasants be getting even more poor, and the hacienda leaders getting more land, more earnings, especially with the model that he's creating. Where more connections with the foreign nations, and then you could sell their product. Who's making the money? The hacienda leaders, and who are his main supporters? The hacienda leaders, right? The rich elite of Mexico City. Exactamente. So in that moment, that economic, and then the political aspect, he's imposing you. No, he's going to be your governor.
Yeah, exactly.
And then we start seeing, these regional leaders, rebel leaders. From the north, Francisco Villa, and from the south, Emiliano Zapata, who was not a peasant exactly, but he understood, the way, peasants work, because he owned, and, he used to work in the fields. And we start seeing this more of a worker into a more of a activist approach of him. We start seeing him, not only meeting with the people to, work, but also, what? Now it's time to, if no one's gonna rise, then let's just form our own collective group, like some type of syndicate, right? Like some union, sorry. But then he sees that there is no way to negotiate with his people. They're established. They're the current establishment.
Which people?
Porfirio Diaz and the government.
But specifically, aren't they sugar growers?
Yes. Yes.
The sugar planters.
Yes.
Right.
In the south. Right. And then that's when we start seeing that. Then they start looking into this more fighting perspective. They're not gonna give us our reforms. They're not gonna give us what we want. So then we're gonna have to do it through the force, through the weapons, right? And then we start seeing, in Ayala, basically, which is a small town in Morelos, because that's where he starts drafting it. But let's not go ahead of ourselves. So what happens when the elections open up? A new opposition leader rises, And this opposition leader,
Francisco Madero.
basically, Francisco Madero, who was from the north, from Torreon, Coahuila, which is like in the border with the United States, he starts campaigning all over Mexico. But he brings a different approach than many other politician leaders. Why? Because not only is he the first politician against Diaz, but he's revolutionary as well.
Right.
So he's also claiming that he wants this regime change.
Once regime, and it's important to know after the interview that Diaz gave, he backtracked, right?
Yeah.
And so he said, I think he said he decided to stay in the presidency, or there was going to be an election.
Yeah.
And then so Madero started this campaign of no reelección, okay?
Yeah.
And he wrote it out. He was sort of imprisoned,
Yeah.
I believe, by Diaz.
Days before the election.
Days before the election, which was obviously a blatant abuse of power, but surprise, surprise. He escapes prison and writes this Plan de San Luis Potosí, right? Essentially calling for free and fair elections, which was inspired in part by Benito Juarez. And so then Diaz self-exiles.
Yeah.
He leaves the country, essentially says this is a mess.
France, right?
Goes to France. Yeah, I think he
Ironically.
lived the rest
Yes,
of his life
exactly.
in Paris. Right.
Who did they have the war
The
against?
Friends of
Yeah.
Mexico, yeah.
And who did he get the country back to?
And then so a provisional president enters until they have elections that Madero wins.
So basically.